Hi, everyone. My name is Tahereh Kademi, and I'm a law clerk with the Education Advocacy Program at the Moran Center for Youth Advocacy. I've spent a lot of this summer doing research on different disabilities, but a majority of that research has been devoted to dyslexia. So I've decided to compile all of that research for you and your child and your student and present it in the form of a Know Your Rights presentation. Before I start, I want to make it known that I am not an attorney and I am not giving legal advice. Instead, I'm here to simply give some more information about what dyslexia is, talk about how it's recognized, provide some tips and ideas about how to talk about this disability with the school, and eventually towards the end, I will also provide some resources that you can reach out to. I'm really glad that you are tuning in today to get more information about dyslexia, and I hope that this presentation provides you with the information that you came here seeking. And if not, as always, please feel free to reach out to the Moran Center. We are here to help in any capacity that we can. First, I want to start off by telling you all a little bit about the Moran Center and who we are. The organization is based in the Evanston community, and it offers legal, social, and restorative justice services to members of the Evanston community. Our spirit really pivots around three key goals: fostering justice in the courtroom, access to the classroom, and restoration within the community. I've provided our contact information for you so it's easy to access. Our phone number is 847-492-1410. I've also provided the web link for our direct messaging portal. So essentially what would happen if you clicked on this link or you copy and pasted it is it would take you to part of our website that has a bit of a spot for you to be able to add your contact information and to connect with the Moran Center in that capacity. As always, we are here to help. It's something that I will be repeating multiple times throughout this presentation. The Moran Center is here and is really wants to serve this community. So anything that we can do or questions that you may have, please feel free to reach out to us through any of these avenues. I've spent this summer working with the Moran Center's Education Advocacy Program, which advocates for Evanston students with special needs and those who are also facing exclusion from school. When we think about the laws that govern disability and special education, we typically turn to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The common acronym for this is IDEA, IDEA, and I'll typically be referring to it as IDEA throughout the presentation. IDEA is essentially a federal statute that stands as the main point of reference for special education law. And there are two main pillars to IDEA: the free appropriate public education aspect, or FAPE, F-A-P-E, and the least restrictive environment aspect, or LRE. Speaking about free appropriate public education, this component of IDEA, it requires that children with disabilities receive special education services that meet their unique needs and that these services are rendered for free. Additionally, the other pillar, the least restrictive environment component, this highlights how crucial it is for children with disabilities to be educated alongside their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. So we're trying to keep students that do have disabilities in the same environment as their peers that do not have disabilities. This is a really big part of IDEA. Now, IDEA categorizes disabilities into 13 different categories, which I've put up on the screen here, all 13. IDEA requires that the disability for which a student requests special education services for fall within at least one of these 13 categories. And one of the most commonly utilized categories is number one, the specific learning disability category. And this is known as an SLD. And again, I apologize for the abundance of acronyms, but there are so many. So I hope it's somewhat easy to keep track as I go through the presentation. So specific learning disability, I'll be referring to as SLD. And this is typically the category that dyslexia falls under. The category of specific learning disability. This category focuses on disabilities that are rooted in psychological processes that are imperative to understanding or using language. These sorts of disabilities, they typically manifest as deficits in listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or even carrying out mathematical calculations. And again, this is actually the category within which dyslexia falls, seeing as though dyslexia oftentimes manifests as those aforementioned deficits. Since about 1994, there's been a lot of discussion around what exactly dyslexia is. How do we brainstorm and craft a simple paragraph or a sentence to explain something that is so incredibly unique to each person and so complex? The original definition of the International Dyslexia Association, which is the IDA, not to be confused with IDEA, the statute that we were previously talking about. So the International Dyslexia Association, the IDA, stated that dyslexia is insufficient phonological processing, which results in difficulty with single word decoding and thus creates a difficulty with reading, writing, and spelling. This definition was sort of revamped in 2002 by the IDA to read as follows. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. This definition, I think, creates a much more substantial foundation of dyslexia as a disability that stems from the biology of the nervous system. And the definition really concretely displays the interconnectedness of this system and the effects of that system as it functions on the symptoms that we see manifest for students that have dyslexia. Oftentimes, definitions create a sort of stigmatization of what it means to live with a disability. At one point, there was a lot of research surrounding how boys are diagnosed with dyslexia at higher rates, but that was sort of dispelled earlier on as testing evolved and studies began to reflect how it was likely that boys simply showed more overt symptoms of dyslexia, or even that they reported these symptoms more often than girls did. And contemporary studies show that nearly the same percent of males and females that are diagnosed with dyslexia. There is absolutely no predisposition to it based off of the sex one is assigned at birth. In a like manner, I think the stigma around dyslexia oftentimes pushes people to assume that individuals within certain socioeconomic groups or racial groups are predisposed to this disability. In fact, dyslexia affects people in every group, be it based off of sex, finances, race, or any other particular characteristic. However, studies do show that students that grow up in high poverty, particularly under-resourced areas, are less likely to have the resources that are needed to both diagnose and therefore address a lot of the symptoms that we see that accompany with dyslexia. And as a result, students within these areas, they do present deficits at higher rates than their counterparts that live in more affluent, resourceful communities. Something that I felt was super important to include was this idea about how dyslexia actually manifests in real time, in real life. One of the more common confusions is, why a student in college becomes diagnosed with dyslexia. Parents often ask why now? But the reality is that the manifestations of symptoms truly varies by each person. So while it's common for people to begin showing signs in elementary school or middle school, the onset of symptoms of dyslexia can be as early as preschool age, seeing as though this is when we see children sort of start to interact more with language and with sounds. When one notices some of the deficits I'll be touching on in their preschoolers, it's really important to make note and potentially see a professional. I'll eventually talk a little bit more about why keeping notes and having a sort of log about what you see is important. But just to preface this all, if you do see any of these deficits sort of appearing in your student or your child, just jot them down and have them with you and keep them. How exactly is dyslexia diagnosed? There is unfortunately no single test for dyslexia the way that there is for many other disabilities. Instead, professionals will evaluate a variety of factors when determining if certain deficits are actually stemming from this disability. And this includes any educational deficits, which is one reason why it's super important to take notes, medical history, vision and hearing test results, home life, and psychological testing. All of these are typically assessed through the evaluation process. And these evaluations are typically done by a psychologist, specifically one that has an educational background, or a neuropsychologist, or a neurologist themselves. A lot of the time people ask how they quote unquote got dyslexia. And it's important to remember that dyslexia is a disability that truly cannot be reduced to one cause, which is also what contributes to this sort of lack of universal tests to determine the presence of it. However, contemporary studies have shown that there may be a genetic predisposition to dyslexia, which is why a family history of dyslexia or other learning disabilities may increase the chance of a child having dyslexia. Additionally, we've seen premature birth or a particularly low birth rate, contributing to the chances of a child having dyslexia, or even exposure to particular substances that may affect the brain development of the fetus. When I began my research around dyslexia, this is my favorite part. I'm really excited to talk about this entire presentation, but this is something that really sort of got me excited and really, really intrigued me. When I began my research around dyslexia, more than anything, I was curious about what exactly goes on within the brain to contribute to these very overt symptoms that we notice for people that live with dyslexia. And I've listed some parts of the brain that are essentially at the crux of what happens in someone's brain when they have dyslexia. The parietal lobe is the portion of the brain that deals with word analysis. This part of the brain, it's critical for effectively mapping what we read onto what we hear. It's also very important for being able to effectively understand both spoken and written language, and just for reading in general. The occipital lobe deals with how we access words, especially as we read. So it's involved with this ability to automatically access words and read fluently. Now, there are two types of matter in the brain, gray and white. Gray matter is responsible for processing information. And in contrast, white matter is required for our nerves to be able to communicate with one another within the brain and across the brain. So what do these mean? That they're, to me, they were just some random terms about the brain that I was really, really confused about. Well, individuals with dyslexia have a lot more active frontal lobes and less activity in the parietal and occipital lobes, which are responsible for reading, decoding words, and mapping words to sounds. Additionally, people with dyslexia typically have less gray matter in the left parietal lobe of the brain, which affects the ability to process information and sounds. And they also have less white matter in the left parietal lobe of the brain, which affects reading and information processing as well. And I've provided a label diagram of each of these parts of the brain as well. I'm a really visual learner, so seeing this was sort of really helpful. We have the frontal lobe over here. We have the parietal lobe, and we have the occipital lobe. And just to go through them one more time, the parietal lobe is the portion of the brain that deals with word analysis. So it's critical for effectively mapping what we read onto what we hear. The occipital lobe, it deals with how we access words and read fluently. And the entirety of the brain, it's made up of these two types of matter, gray and white. Just to sort of recap, being able to decode words and to map what we hear onto what we see, it's all caught up in these particular processes of the brain and these particular parts that make up the brain. So it's incredibly complex and incredibly intricate, but this was something that was really, really intriguing for me. So remember, when we've talked a little bit about how dyslexia operates on the brain, it's important to remember that this particular area, so dyslexia, individuals with dyslexia, they typically have a lot more active frontal lobes and less activity in the parietal and the occipital lobes, which are responsible for reading, decoding words, mapping words to sounds. I want to transition and talk a little bit about what dyslexia may look like in the classroom and how this differs based off of grade. The signs I'm about to elaborate on are by no means an exhaustive list of what dyslexia can manifest as, and it's important to note that you know your student or your child best. So if you have any concerns surrounding this topic, absolutely talk to special ed services at your child's school, or reach out to the Moran Center and connect with us, and we will see how we can help as well. In preschoolers, some common signs of dyslexia include difficulty learning nursing rhymes, difficulty learning/remembering names of letters and alphabet, difficulty with recognizing letters found in the child's name, mispronouncing familiar words, and difficulty recognizing rhyming patterns. For example, hat, cat, mat, and rat. In kindergarten and first graders, common signs of dyslexia include difficulty associating letters with their sounds, verbalizing a difficulty with reading. Some students may even, quote unquote, disappear during reading time. Difficulty understanding that words can be broken up into separate parts. And difficulty connecting sounds of letters on a given page. An example of this is showing a photo of the word dog, photo of a dog and the word dog, but the child responds and labels it a puppy. So this sort of shows that there is a difficulty in retrieving, there is a retrieval of the word that they have associated with that particular photo, but there is not an actual reading of the word that is on the page to label that this is actually a dog. For second through eighth graders, some common signs include difficulty processing and understanding what a student hears, difficulty remembering the sequence of things, difficulty noticing similarities or differences in letters or words, difficulty in sounding out pronunciation of unfamiliar words. Oftentimes, students will make guesses because they cannot sound out words. Avoiding reading out loud or activities that involve reading. So this sort of builds on this idea that we talked about in, I believe, the previous slide about disappearing when there are reading activities. A difficulty with spelling, searching for a specific word but ends up using vague terms. So for example, stuff, thing, or that, and confusing words that sound alike. It's really, really interesting to see how a lot of these symptoms or signs that we see of dyslexia, they do build on one another, which is why there is some overlap. And I think that's something that's pretty noteworthy regardless of age. For high schoolers and beyond, common signs include difficulty with math problems, extreme fatigue from reading, anxiety around speaking or frequent use of ums, difficulty in retrieving words, confusion with names that sound alike, difficulty summarizing stories, and difficulty with memorization. I want to just note this again because it's really important. There is no set template for dyslexia. It manifests differently within each individual, regardless of some of the overlap that we see in these sort of signs and symptoms of this disability. And if you feel that your child is demonstrating any of these signs, or maybe they're demonstrating signs that are not listed here, but you feel reflect a potential dyslexia diagnosis, keep note of those signs and definitely feel empowered to ask your student's school to conduct an evaluation for a specific learning disability. I want to move on and play a tiny bit of trivia. True or false? Dyslexia disappears when a student learns to read. This is false. Dyslexia is not something that simply goes away. It's, as we discussed, a physiological change in the way that the brain works, and it is remedied by way of accommodations or modifications that oftentimes are present in IEPs. Number 2, dyslexia is caused by not reading enough at home. This is also false. Oftentimes, society attributes disabilities to a lack of effort on the part of the person with that disability. And this does such a disservice to the person, but also completely goes against the logic behind how disabilities affect our physiology. And as we talked about with the way that the brain is affected by dyslexia, this is something that we see has its root in the process and the way the way that our brain process information. And lastly, mixing up letters while reading and writing is the biggest sign of dyslexia. False. Some students with dyslexia may not even mix up letters. They may manifest the disability in a completely different way, which just highlights how the lived experience of someone with dyslexia, it varies from person to person. And it's important to know that dyslexia is not the following. It is not a visual perception problem. It is not just reversing letters or words. It is not just a problem for specific groups of people, and it is not outgrown over time. Now, this isn't to say that vision is never part of the issue. It's very possible that someone with dyslexia does have vision deficits or is reversing letters and words, but this is just to say that these are not the end all be all templates for the showing of this particular disability. If you think you or your child or your student may have dyslexia, keep notes on what you see, contact special education services at their school, and request for your child or your student to be evaluated for a specific learning disability, because this is the particular category that dyslexia is categorized under IDEA. Be sure to have your notes with you. An evaluation will typically be conducted, and these are oftentimes at no cost to the family. However, you are able to contact your own psychologist or neurologist for an evaluation, and this may be an out-of-pocket cost or it may be covered by insurance. Depending on the results of those evaluations, a meeting will be set to determine the eligibility. And should your student be deemed eligible for special education services, the special ed team will begin the process of developing an IEP for that student. Once your child has been deemed eligible for an IEP, there are so many accommodations that can be requested. And I wanted to just go over some of these. Some of these accommodations include a test proctor for clarification of questions, access to keyboards, having a scribe to record a student's responses. This is also for note taking. If a student needs somebody to record notes for them, have a scribe in the middle of class because it's difficult for them to pay attention and record notes at the same time. This could also be for an exam, having somebody sit there and record the oral responses of the student. Having extended test time, the dictation of test responses, having a calculator, as we've seen that dyslexia oftentimes isn't always about just reading or writing. It oftentimes does manifest itself as a deficit with mathematics, and assistive technology devices, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some really helpful ways to mitigate some of the difficulties that we see in students with dyslexia. There's also a lot of really, really great dyslexia tech, which was super cool to hear about. And I sort of stumbled upon when I was doing my research. There are dyslexia fonts, and these are specific fonts that take into account how even just the way a letter looks and it's organized amidst other letters affects its readability for students that have dyslexia. There are live scribe smart pens or the scan marker or similar technology. And this is basically technology that digitizes your handwritten notes and also allows the student to even record audio. I stumbled upon something called Sortigories, which is an online reading practice that focuses on sounding out words, learning their meanings, and improving our understanding of how words relate to one another. There is also text-to-speech software, audiobooks, and there are also a lot of apps, which I have included here as well. As I begin to wrap up, I want to talk a bit about what to look out for in your student's IEP. As you look over the draft that's provided you, make sure that your student's disability is categorized as a specific learning disability. Additionally, go over the goals and ask yourself if these are specific to your student's disability, if they are appropriately ambitious, and if they'll actually help your student meet their goals. And this is really, really important because those goals are required to be appropriately ambitious. They are supposed to help your student move forward and to progress in their education and to be able to effectively do so. Under the free, appropriate, and public education pillar of IDEA, FAPE, it's really important to ensure that your student's IEP identifies their needs and it institutes the appropriate services for them to effectively learn. I've also provided a few local resources that are also really, really great. And we've been in contact with a lot at the Moran Center. Evanston Case is a nonprofit that offers community, advocacy, support, and education services to Evanston families. And for all of these particular organizations, I've provided their website as well. Dyslexia Connection of Evanston is a really, really great, really wonderful support group for people impacted by dyslexia. And they offer meetups and speakers and events. And it's sort of just a community for people that have been impacted by dyslexia to go and to talk and to meet and to have this community. There's also Redwood Literacy Chicago, and this is a nonprofit that provides reading intervention. I'm not entirely sure what the exact price points are, but the website does discuss how these services are offered at varying price points, so this may be something to look into as well. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to the education advocacy team at the Moran Center. You can call us at 847-492-1410 anytime, and we'd be super happy to help you out. And again, there are other various ways to connect with us, including the direct messaging portal that we have on our website and for which I have provided the link. And these are some of the resources I use to compile this information, all of which have such great information. If you want to sort of just gain some more information, if you want to fact check me, please look at these wonderful websites. They have a lot of good stuff to share about this particular disability. Thank you all so much for tuning into this presentation. And I really hope this presentation has provided some insight into what is an incredibly complex topic. And truly, if there is anything else that the Moran Center can do to help you, your student, or anybody that you may know that is impacted by dyslexia or any other disability, please reach out to us. We're here to help always, and we're here for this particular community. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to talk to you soon, and we hope to connect.